Matthew McGovern was born in 1878 in the town of Carrigaline in County Leitrim, Ireland. His parents were Patrick McGovern and Alice Brady. They have 6 other children: Marianne, Edward, Charles, Alice, Margaret, and Ellen. We know from the 1901 census that Patrick was a farmer who most likely rented his land. The family probably faced a tough existence, and in 1901 Matthew left to start a new life in New York, arriving at Ellis Island on September 4th on the ship the Oceanic, which left from Queenstown. He has $20 on him and describes himself as a laborer. He indicates that he will be staying with his sister Marianne, who came to New York in 1896 and lives on East 53rd Street. For the next few years, Mattie seems to be finding work as a house shorer. He indicates that on the 1905 census, where he is listed as a boarder in an apartment, and on his 1910 application for naturalization. A house shorer is a person who specializes in installing wooden beams to support structures, and in the growing metropolis of Manhattan, there was probably plenty of work to be had by an industrious young man. In 1906, Mattie marries Mary Cullen, herself an Irish immigrant who arrived from County Cavan in 1900. They get married at Holy Cross Church in Manhattan on December 30th, 1906, with Mary's sister Alice as one of the witnesses. They seem to be a great pair and partners, and as Mattie becomes an accomplished businessman, Mary is frequently at his side at Irish social events around Manhattan. In fact, at the first annual ball of the Mattie McGovern Association, held at Donovan's Hall in 1910, it was noted in the Irish Advocate that Mattie had a great time from helping the boys from kidnapping his wife, as she was a very popular girl before they got married. 10 months after getting married, they welcomed their first child, Alice, into the world, and in 1909 they welcomed their next daughter, Cecilia. Mattie seems to be continuing to work as a house shorer as late as 1918, when he lists his employer as the Pierce Foundation Company on his World War I draft card. But Mattie seems to have an entrepreneurial spirit and is searching out other possibilities for employment. He seems to have a great personality for gaining the trust and loyalty of others, and in 1910 we see the first record of the Mattie McGovern Association, a dance that he sponsors in a rented hall. In fact, this first one is held at Donovan's Hall, one of the biggest dance halls in the city that could accommodate thousands of patrons. Observing that gathering in 1910, the Irish American Advocate noted that the credit is due to the happy disposition of the standard-bearer, Mr. McGovern, and the young men who helped to make the thing a success. We also know that in 1910, Mattie was an authorized agent for the Irish American Advocate, a prominent newspaper that was a favorite of Irish immigrants coming to New York. Mattie will have a relationship with the newspaper for a long time, often advertising his dance halls. As an aside, another authorized agent is James Boylan, who must become a good friend, and eventually is one of the premier travel agents for various cruise lines that transport between Ireland and New York. In fact, Mattie's daughter Alice will visit Black Lion Ireland in 1913 along with her Aunt Alice Cullen and Uncle John Cullen, and the trip is all arranged for by Mr. James Boylan. Mattie never owns these properties, but organizes dances and gatherings in a wide variety of halls and spaces that he rents. In 1910 we see his association with the Imperial Lyceum, one of the biggest halls in New York. It had 2 large halls, and Mattie supplied 2 large orchestras to play in them. He will use this space on and off over the next 30 years. In 1914, he holds a benefit for the churches of Carrigaline, his hometown in Ireland. And in 1916, he holds a barn dance at the Lyceum to honor the fighting 69th military veterans. We see advertisements for his 1919 masked ball, and Mattie is referred to as the best-known provider of entertainment in New York. He seems to take a multi-year hiatus from the Imperial, probably because he is doing so well in other locations. Mattie's operations can now be found around New York. In 1912, he was operating out of the Arbor Casino on 52nd and 7th. In 1916, he was operating out of the Celtic House in Coney Island along with partner Tom Hand, one of the most famous Irish dancers of the day. In 1916, he is the manager of Barry's Hotel Cafe and Restaurant in the Rockaways. All the while he is listing his main occupation as house shore. At the same time, Mary has had 3 more children, Genevieve in 1911, Matthew in 1916, and Margaret, nicknamed Peggy, in 1917. But Mary still appears alongside Mattie, as noted in several descriptions of these big socials. So does his daughter Alice, who at the age of 3, is at Donovan's in 1910 when 500 couples danced in the Grand March, and according to eyewitness accounts, Mattie furnished 2 beautiful bouquets of flowers, which his 3-year-old daughter and her little escort, Richard Hurley, also 3 years old, presented. The 2 little tots got great applause when they walked down the floor, arm in arm, to present the flowers, as published in the Irish American Advocate. The 1920s seem to be the heydays of Mattie's career, and McGovern's Halls becomes a more permanent and well-known dance hall located at 1382 3rd Avenue, between 78 and 79 Streets. It was sometimes referred to as the Mecca of Mirth. This was another very large space. It consisted of 2 large halls. The first floor was for balls and receptions. The second floor was for Irish dancing. The third floor was for checking and dressing rooms, and the fourth floor was for meeting rooms. Irish dances included the jig, reel, set, and step dancing, while American dancing included the Charleston, the foxtrot, black bottom, and old-time waltzes. Prohibition was in place from 1920 to 1932, undoubtedly an obstacle for Mattie and saloon keepers like him. Mattie had long served alcohol in his dance halls. Andy continued to do so during Prohibition when it was illegal. The shores of Long Island and Queens were active with rum runners selling beer and alcohol shipped down from Canada, and Mattie's operations were in full swing during the 1920s. We do know that Mattie applied for and received his liquor license in October 1934 when Prohibition had ended, and he was once again legally allowed to sell beer, wine, and liquor at retail in a restaurant. During the 1920s and 30s, Mattie provided lots of entertainment, including the band led by his brother-in-law called Professor McIntyre's Irish Volunteer Orchestra, now playing in the background, as well as dancers Tommy Hand, Jimmy Egan, Irish step dancers, and other bands that included Professor Hogan's Orchestra and Professor Johnny Flynn's Orchestra. Mattie also established the Pleasant Hour Dance Hall in the Rockaways in the 1920s at the Boardwalk and Beach 104th. This operation was open all summer long and was a big hit in an area known as the Irish Riviera. The place was big enough to host 2 halls, one for Irish dancing and another for American dancing. Food was served, and according to one reviewer, the most popular dishes are spare ribs and cabbage, ham, corned beef, and cabbage. This is the only known existing picture of the Pleasant Hour, and pictured are Mattie behind the bar, his son Matthew dressed in white, and then his son-in-law John Clark, a member of the New York Police Department, along with an unknown person on the far left. According to the Irish Advocate, the rooms are mostly outside rooms, airy and well ventilated, with a breeze always coming off the ocean. Any time of day, from 1 o'clock on, there is always something doing, and Mattie is on hand. A 1932 article states, Rockaway Beach would not be the same if the presence of Mattie McGovern and his Pleasant Hour Cabaret and Dance Hall ceased to exist. It was noted how Mattie stayed on top of new technology. Mattie has another new innovation, and that is the installation of a loudspeaker and microphone. In this way, the entertainment and music are heard within a radius of 2 blocks. Mary's brother Terence Cullen arrived in the United States in 1930 and lived with the McGoverns. He becomes a fixture at the dance halls as an assistant to Mattie, who appreciated how his brother-in-law refrained from drinking alcohol, an important characteristic during Prohibition. In 1937, Terence was described as a fine young man in an article about the Pleasant Hour. Throughout the 1930s, Mattie returned to running the Imperial Lyceum with help from Terry. In 1940, the building was torn down, but it had quite the reputation. The New York Times covered the demolition and interviewed a man who remembered the Lyceum in its heyday. He stated, On the fourth floor there was American dancing, and underneath there was Irish dancing. There was plenty of windows busted there. But they used to have a lot of fun too. It was worth your life to go to the old Lyceum in those days. They used to sell liquor there, but lots of guys brought their own. Those were the days. Mattie continued working construction during the day and acting as an Irish impresario at night and on weekends. In an effort to provide for his family, he would also take up a new title teacher. Mattie was a teacher of Irish dancing as early as 1911 when the Irish American Advocate wrote, Mr. Matt McGovern, who is a well-known figure at most of the leading Irish events, is about to bloom out as a dancing instructor. We see an advertisement in 1911 for his classes at the Eagle Dancing Academy on West 50th Street. And in 1912, Mattie opened a dance school at Ties Hall on 98th Street and 3rd Avenue, about which a newspaper wrote, Mattie McGovern, who has several years of experience as a dancing instructor, is conductor of the classes. On the 1925 New York State Census, Mattie lists his occupation as teacher. By 1940, Mattie updates his occupation on the census and describes himself as the owner of a dance hall. Mattie has clearly climbed high in the Irish social order of New York City. Further proof of this is the purchase by he and Mary of the residence they live in, a 5-story brownstone at 348 East 78th Street. They purchased it from Mr. Edward Burns on April 6, 1926. The Roaring Twenties have been pretty good to the McGoverns. Mattie was now a landlord with about 10 apartments, many occupied by family members. Mattie's final business enterprise was McGovern's Tavern, which opened on 9th Avenue and 34th Street in 1940. Mattie hired none other than Mike McTeague, the famous Irish boxer who was the light heavyweight champion of the world between 1923 and 1925, to be the manager of his establishment. The grand opening of the tavern merited an article in the Irish Advocate that begins, Mattie McGovern. Where did we hear that name before? Why, folks, it's a great name, a famous name in this small city of New York. Mattie and Mary had a son, Matthew, who worked in the family business serving as a bartender in Mattie's various locations. There is not much on record about Matthew, though someone recalled him as being dapper. He unfortunately died at the age of 25 in 1941, no doubt breaking the heart of his parents. In fact, his father would pass away the next year. Mary Cullen McGovern lived in the apartment building on East 78th Street until her passing in 1956. We're going to do a whole chapter on the Cullen side of the family. Mary left the building to her daughters Alice, Cecilia, Genevieve, and Peggy, all of whom are going to be talked about in a future chapter. Mattie's obituary in 1942 reveals that hundreds of people came to the McGovern home on East 78th Street to pay their respects. The obituary also noted that Mattie was a fixture in Irish amusement enterprises, and he made good he owned the house he lived and died in, which is a tribute to his ability and success in the business he engaged in. He was always the same good-natured and kindly Irishman, liked by the kids and the adults too. In all his vicissitudes of time and place, his shingle carried with it the hallmark of popularity. 21 years later, in a 1963 obituary of his daughter Genevieve, Mattie was referred to as the governor of the Rockaways. Mattie was laid to rest at Calvary Cemetery in a plot he now shares with his wife Mary and his son Matthew. Mattie lived a full life. From working on a farm in Ireland, he endures the pain of saying goodbye to his parents in 1900 to better himself. He works construction jobs, and somehow through sheer force of personality, he becomes a kind of Irish impresario in Manhattan. He must have held dances and balls over the course of 3 decades in over 30 different locations, some of them capable of holding several thousand people. He most likely had to deal with unsavory bootleggers while running his own speakeasies, and yet he prospered during Prohibition and during the Great Depression. In all the research done, not a bad word was ever written about him. To the contrary, he seems to have had an abundance of optimism and a gregarious personality. His descendants are the beneficiaries of his difficult decision to leave Ireland and the life he built for his family.